The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It was a raw, wounded sound that clawed at the log walls of Nathaniel's cabin, searching for any chink, any weakness to exploit. Outside, the world had vanished. There were no mountains, no sprawling plains of dormant buffalo grass, no distant line of ponderosa pines. There was only the white fury of the blizzard, a churning chaos that had descended from the gray heavens without warning, swallowing the Wyoming landscape whole. For Nathaniel, the storm was a fitting companion. It mirrored the tempest that had raged inside him for 2 long years, a grief so vast it had its own weather systems. He sat at his small, hand-hewn table, a steaming mug of weak coffee cupped in his calloused hands. The cabin was a testament to his solitude. 1 chair, 1 plate, 1 cot in the corner. It was the fortress of a man who had walled himself off from the world, a man who had learned the hard way that to love was to invite loss. The fire in the stone hearth spat and crackled, a lone soldier fighting back the encroaching cold. Its flickering light danced across the room, illuminating the worn stock of his rifle resting against the wall and the thick, dark expanse of the grizzly bear pelt spread before it. The pelt had been a victory from a different lifetime, a trophy from a man who had once believed in conquering the wild. Now it was just a barrier against the drafts that snaked up through the floorboards. He stared into the flames, his mind drifting back to the faces he tried so hard to forget because remembering was a pain too sharp to bear. The soft smile of his wife, Emma, and the bright, mischievous eyes of their daughter, little Rose. The diphtheria had taken them in the space of a week, leaving him with nothing but a silence that was louder than any storm. He had sold their farm back east and come west, seeking not a new life but a place where he could serve out his sentence of survival in peace. This remote plot of land with its temperamental creek and stubborn soil had become his exile. A sudden violent thump against the door jolted him from his reverie. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was solid, deliberate. Nathaniel froze, his hand tightening around his mug. No one came out this far. Not in good weather, and certainly not in a blizzard that could blind a man in 10 paces. His nearest neighbor, Frank, was 5 miles away, and they shared little more than a mutual, unspoken dislike. Thump, twump, thump, thump, more urgent this time. A fist, not the wind. A raw instinct, honed by years of solitude in an untamed land, sent a jolt of alarm through him. He set his mug down with a soft click and rose, his tall frame moving with a quiet economy. He grabbed the rifle, its cold weight of familiar, grim comfort in his hands. He didn't cock it, but his thumb rested near the hammer. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice rough from disuse. The only answer was the shriek of the wind and another frantic pounding on the thick oak door. It was a sound of pure desperation. Whoever was on the other side was at the end of their rope. Cursing under his breath, Nathaniel slid the heavy bar from its brackets. The wind tore the door from his grip, slamming it inward with a deafening crash. A blast of ice and snow surged into the cabin, extinguishing half the candles and sending embers scattering from the hearth. And in the doorway, framed against the swirling white abyss, stood a figure that seemed born of the storm itself. It was a woman, an Indian woman, her deerskin clothes caked with snow, her long black hair whipped into a frenzy by the wind. But it was her face that seized his attention. Her features were sharp, carved from defiance, and her dark eyes burned with an intensity that defied the freezing cold. She wasn't pleading for help. She was there to claim it. She took a staggering step inside, and he saw she was not alone. She was half carrying, half dragging a younger boy, who was wrapped in a thin blanket and shivering violently. The boy's head lolled against her shoulder, his face flushed with a fever so high Nathaniel could feel its heat even from a distance. "He needs help," the woman said, her voice low and strained, but as firm as bedrock. She spoke English, clipped and precise. There was no pleas, no supplication. It was a statement of fact, a demand. Nathaniel stood there for a moment, rifle still in hand, his mind struggling to catch up. He lowered the weapon slowly, his gaze fixed on the boy. He knew that look, the glassy eyes, the trembling that shook the boy's entire frame. He had seen it before in his own home, in his own daughter. He finally found his voice. Get him to the fire. Bar the door." The woman needed no further instruction. With a strength that surprised him, she guided the boy to the bearskin rug and gently lowered him onto its thick fur. Nathaniel fought the door, his muscles straining against the storm's fury until he finally slammed it shut and slid the heavy bar back into place. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the boy's ragged, shallow breaths. Nathaniel knelt on the other side of the boy, his medical knowledge limited to what a farmer needs to know about setting bones and stitching cuts. "What happened?" "He fell," she said, pulling the wet blanket away from the boy. "His leg is broken. The fever came this morning." She pushed aside the boy's leggings, revealing a crudely made splint and a swollen, discolored shin. "It was a bad break. The fever. Is it from the break, or is he sick?" Nathaniel asked, his throat tight. The woman's eyes met his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something other than fierce determination. It was fear, sharp and potent. I do not know. We were tracking. I came to this creek. For the asterisk, Ashaya Lea asterisk. She pointed a slender, frozen finger vaguely towards the window. Yarrow. For the fever. But the storm came too fast. He understood. She hadn't been seeking his cabin. She had been seeking a cure that grew on his land. He was an obstacle, a complication, but now, a necessity. He looked from her proud, unyielding face to the suffering boy. The ghosts of Emma and Rose whispered in the corners of the room. He could not turn them away. He would not. I have some whiskey and clean bandages, he said, rising. It's not much, but we can clean the wound and reset the splint properly. For the next hour they worked in a strange, unspoken partnership. He brought hot water from the kettle, tore strips from one of his few clean shirts for bandages, and held the boy steady. She, with hands that were surprisingly gentle, cleaned the area around the break, her touch deft and sure. She spoke to her brother in their native tongue, a series of soft, murmuring sounds meant to soothe his fevered mind. When the time came to set the bone, Nathaniel braced the boy's shoulders. The boy cried out a thin, pained sound and then fell into an exhausted, restless sleep. The cabin grew quiet again. The storm still raged, a constant howling reminder of their confinement. Nathaniel added another log to the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He glanced at the woman. She sat on the rug, her back ramrod straight, one hand resting on the boy's forehead. She had not moved an inch. You should get some rest, Nathaniel said quietly. You can take the cot. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the boy. No, I will watch him. The floor is cold. You'll freeze. Her gaze finally lifted, sweeping across the small room. It passed over the single cot, the hard-packed dirt floor, and then settled on the massive bearskin rug where her brother lay. There was more than enough room for two. Her eyes, dark and resolute, met his. We will not freeze, she declared, her voice leaving no room for argument. The fire is warm here. The skin is thick. She shifted slightly, making it clear what she intended. She was not leaving the boy's side. So if he wanted to offer her warmth and shelter, it would be on her terms. Nathaniel felt a surge of disbelief. This woman, a complete stranger, was not just in his home, but was now dictating the sleeping arrangements. He was a man accustomed to his own space, his own rules. The very idea of lying down just a few feet from her, sharing the same small island of warmth in the vast cold of his cabin, was unthinkable. It was too close, too intimate. It crossed a boundary he hadn't even known existed until this moment. He opened his mouth to protest, to insist she'd take the cot, to assert his ownership of this space. But the word died on his lips. He saw the unwavering resolve in her eyes, a will forged in a world far harsher than his own. He saw the fierce, protective love she had for her brother. She was not asking. She was demanding. And in that moment he understood that arguing was as useless as arguing with the blizzard itself. With a slow, resigned nod, he took his own worn blanket from the cot. He walked over to the far side of the bearskin rug, a chasm of a few feet separating him from her. The heat from the fire washed over him, a stark contrast to the chill of apprehension that had settled deep in his bones. He lay down on his back, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin. The fur of the great bear was soft beneath him. He could hear the soft whisper of the woman's breathing, could feel the subtle shift of her weight on the skin. He stared up at the smoke-stained ceiling, every muscle in his body tensed. The night stretched before him, an uncharted territory of silence and proximity. Outside, the storm screamed its fury. Inside, the only sounds were the fire, the sick boy's labored breaths, and the frantic pounding of his own heart. Nathaniel held his breath, knowing it would be the longest night of his entire life. Time seemed to warp in the firelit cabin. Minutes stretched into eternities, each one measured by the frantic rasp of the boy's breathing and the relentless assault of the wind. Nathaniel lay perfectly still, his body a rigid line on the edge of the bearskin. Quote, he was acutely aware of everything, the subtle scent of pine and wet leather that clung to the woman beside him, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of her shoulders with each breath, the radiating warmth that crossed the small distance between them. It was an intimacy so profound and so unwelcome that it felt like a physical weight on his chest. He was a man who had built his life around emptiness, cultivating a space no one could enter. Now that space had been breached by a stranger who lay a mere arm's length away, a silent partner in this strange and desperate vigil. He felt like a trespasser in his own sanctuary. Hours crawled by. The fire settled into a bed of glowing orange coals, casting long, dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel vast and uncertain. The boy, Keel, began to toss in his fevered sleep, muttering words in a language Nathaniel couldn't understand. Instantly, the woman was alert. She shifted, her movement fluid and silent, and leaned over her brother. She dipped a rag into a bowl of now cool water and gently dabbed his forehead. Her touch was infinitely tender. a stark contrast to the warrior's fierceness that had first confronted Nathaniel at his door. She murmured to him again, her voice a low, soothing melody that seemed to quiet his restless spirit. Watching her, Nathaniel felt something shift within him. The initial fear and resentment he'd felt at her intrusion began to fray at the edges, replaced by a grudging respect. This was not just a woman of iron will. She was a sister fighting for her brother's life with the only weapon she had: knowledge, endurance, and a love so fierce it was palpable in the enclosed space. The silence that fell afterward felt different, less tense, more thoughtful. "He's strong," Nathaniel said, his voice a low rumble that felt too loud in the quiet room. "He's fighting." She didn't look up from her brother, but she answered, "He is Keel. It means sparrow. He has a sparrow's heart. Small, but it beats very fast and very hard. A name." It made the boy reel, more than just a casualty of the storm. "And you?" Nathaniel asked, the question leaving his lips before he could stop it. She paused, her hand hovering over Keel's chest. Then she turned her head, and her dark eyes met his across the flickering shadows. "My name is Desert Lily." The name suited her. It spoke of beauty that thrived in the harshest of places, of resilience and a quiet, stubborn strength. "Nathaniel," he offered in return. It felt only fair. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, accepting the exchange. "You do not seem like the others, Nathaniel," she said, her gaze unwavering. "What others?" "The men who look at my people and see only animals, or ghosts. They look through us, or they look down on us. You looked at my brother and saw a sick boy." The raw truth in her words silenced him for a moment. He had seen the way men like his neighbor, Frank, looked at the Ute and the Arapaho with a mixture of fear and contempt. "Some men are fools," he finally managed to say. "They fear what they don't understand." A bitter smile touched her lips, a fleeting expression that was more pain than humor. "They understand enough. They understand how to take land that is not theirs. They understand the language of a rifle. My father told me stories of the promises made by your leaders. Their words are like smoke. They look real, but when you try to hold them, there's nothing there." She spoke of broken treaties and forced marshes, of the slow, grinding erosion of her people's way of life. She didn't speak with rage, but with a deep, weary sorrow that was far more potent. It was the sorrow of someone who had witnessed the world she knew slowly fade away. Nathaniel listened, not just to her words, but to the history of pain that lay beneath them. He had come west to escape his own history, but here it was, a different kind of grief, sitting beside him in the dark. "I can't speak for those men," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers. "Their world is not mine. My world. It ended 2 years ago." Desert Lily was silent, but he could feel her attention on him, a silent invitation to continue. The confession came easier than he expected, perhaps because it was spoken into the anonymity of the near darkness, to a stranger who had no preconceived notions of him. "I had a wife, Emma, and a daughter, Rose." Just saying their names was like touching a hot coal. The pain was immediate and searing. She was only 6. She had hair the color of corn silk and a laugh that could make wildflowers grow. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat feeling as large as a stone. The sickness came in the winter. It took them both, one after the other. I built their coffins with my own hands. The story hung in the air between them, a raw, exposed nerve. He hadn't spoken of this to anyone, not in all his time out here. He had simply let the silence and the solitude cauterize the wound, leaving behind a hard, ugly scar. He expected pity, or perhaps an awkward, clumsy attempt at comfort. He got neither. "To lose a child," Desert Lily said, her voice barely a whisper, "is to lose the branch that would carry your spirit to the sky." Her words weren't a comfort. They were a reflection. She wasn't trying to soothe his pain. She was acknowledging it, giving it a name in her own tongue, her own way of understanding the world. And in that moment, the chasm between them, the farmer and the native, the man and the woman, the two solitary souls, seemed to shrink. They were no longer just a white man and an Indian woman forced together by a storm. They were two people who understood the language of loss, two hearts that bore the scars of a world that takes without asking. A fragile truce settled over them. The conversation dwindled, but the silence was now comfortable, companionable. He watched as she finally succumbed to exhaustion, her head drooping until her chin rested on her chest, her hand never leaving her brother's side. Nathaniel stayed awake, watching over them both, his role shifting from unwilling host to something else entirely. He was a guardian. He must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, a pale gray light was filtering through the cabin's single, grimy window. The fire was little more than a pile of white ash with a few stubborn red eyes winking within it. The wind had finally died down, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. He sat up slowly, his muscles stiff and sore. Across the rug, Desert Lily was already awake, her posture as straight and alert as ever. Keel was sleeping peacefully, his breathing deeper and more regular. The fever seemed to have broken. A shared look of relief passed between them. It was a small victory, but a profound one. Nathaniel pushed himself to his feet and walked to the window, rubbing a clear circle in the frost that coated the pane. He peered outside, and his breath caught in his throat. The world was gone, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The snow was piled in massive drifts against the cabin, reaching halfway up the door. His woodpile had vanished. The path to the creek was obliterated. The horizon, the trees, the very shape of the land he knew had been erased and redrawn by the storm. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. They were completely and utterly snowbound. He turned from the window and looked at Desert Lily. She had risen and was standing behind him, her eyes also taking in the immense, silent sea of white. The shelter that had been for one night had just become a prison for an unknown number of days. The truce they had forged in the darkness of the long night would now be tested by the harsh, unforgiving light of day. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of survival, dictated by the rising and setting of a sun they could only perceive as a brightening of the oppressive white landscape. The cabin, once Nathaniel's solitary fortress, became a shared world, its four walls containing the entirety of their existence. The initial awkwardness of their forced proximity gave way to a quiet, functional rhythm. Nathaniel, a man accustomed to the predictable solitude of his chores, found his routine irrevocably altered. He was no longer just tending to his own survival, but to theirs. Each morning he would battle the snow, digging a deeper trench to his dwindling woodpile, the sharp cold burning his lungs. He would check his snares, returning most days with nothing but frozen air, but occasionally with a scrawny rabbit that they would treat as a feast. He rationed his meager supplies, the flour, the salt pork, the precious coffee, with a grim practicality. Desert Lily, in turn, transformed his cabin into a place of healing. She was a silent, observant presence who moved with a purpose that awed him. She found a small cluster of willow shoots peeking through the snow near the creek bank and brewed a bitter tea from the bark, a natural remedy for Keel's fever and pain. She showed Nathaniel how to make a poultice from chewed pine needles and a little bacon grease to draw out infection, a skill she applied to a nasty cut he'd gotten while splitting wood. She wasted nothing. Every potato peel, every drop of fat, every usable scrap was incorporated into their lives. Keel's recovery was the quiet center around which their lives revolved. His fever receded, and the color returned to his cheeks. He began to sit up, his young eyes watching Nathaniel with a cautious curiosity. One afternoon, while Desert Lily was outside gathering more willow bark, Nathaniel sat by the fire, carving a piece of scrap wood with his knife. Keel watched him, his gaze fixed on the small shape emerging from the wood. Without a word, Nathaniel finished the carving, a rough but recognizable sparrow, and held it out to the boy. Keel hesitated, looking from the bird to Nathaniel's face before slowly reaching out and taking it. His small fingers closed around the wood, and a faint, shy smile touched his lips. It was the first smile Nathaniel had seen in his cabin in over 2 years. When Desert Lily returned and saw the carving in her brother's hand, she looked at Nathaniel, and her eyes held a new softness, a warmth that chipped away at the icy walls he had built around his heart. In the long evenings after their meager meal, they would sit by the fire. The silence between them was no longer tense, but filled with a growing understanding. She would tell him stories of her people, tales of the coyote trickster and the creation of the stars. He, in turn, found himself speaking of his farm back east, of the changing seasons, of the simple joy of watching his daughter, Rose, chase butterflies in a summer meadow. They were trading pieces of their pasts, building a bridge between their two vastly different worlds, one story at a time. He learned that her ferocity was a shield for a deep well of compassion. She learned that his silence was not emptiness, but a vessel filled with a grief too heavy for words. The respect that had been born in the darkness of that first night was slowly, quietly, blossoming into something more. It was on the 5th day that the outside world finally broke through their white prison. The snow had compacted, the sun had glazed its surface into a hard crust, and for the first time travel was possible, if treacherous. Nathaniel was outside, securing a loose shutter, when he saw the figure approaching, a burly man on snowshoes, a rifle slung over his shoulder. His heart sank. It was Frank. Frank was a man as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. His face was a roadmap of scowls and suspicions, his eyes a pale, cold blue. He harbored a simmering resentment for Nathaniel, viewing his solitude not as grief, but as arrogance. "Saw your chimney smoke," Frank grunted as he drew near, his eyes already scanning the cabin with a proprietary air. "Figured the blizzard either buried you or you was holed up. You lookin' a little thin, Nate." "Been a long few days, Frank," Nathaniel said, his voice neutral. He stood straighter, unconsciously positioning himself between Frank and the cabin door. Frank's gaze flickered to the door, and then he sniffed the air. "Smells different. You ain't been cooking your usual slop." He took another step, trying to peer past Nathaniel. "Got company?" Before Nathaniel could answer, the cabin door creaked open. Desert Lily stood there, her silhouette framed by the firelight. She had come to call him in, unaware of the visitor. Frank froze. His jaw went slack with disbelief, which quickly curdled into a dark, ugly rage. "Well, I'll be damned," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "So that's your game. Hold up with a squaw while the whole world freezes over." His eyes raked over Desert Lily with a look of pure contempt. "What's the matter, Nate? White women too good for you now?" Nathaniel felt a hot, white fury rise in his chest, a protective instinct so powerful it nearly choked him. "That's enough, Frank." "Enough?" Frank laughed, a harsh barking sound. "I come out here checking if you're alive, and I find you living in sin with a redskin. You brought filth into your house." He gestured to Desert Lily. "Her and what else? You got a whole tribe in there? Stealing your food?" He took a menacing step forward. "I ought to get the sheriff. We'll run him off your land for you. Clean this place up." It was a moment suspended in time. Nathaniel saw the fear that flickered for the first time. In Desert Lily's eyes, not for herself, but for her brother, who was still weak inside. He saw Frank's bigotry, his ignorance, his casual cruelty, and he saw the choice laid bare before him. He could placate Frank, make excuses, try to preserve the fragile peace of his isolated life, or he could stand for what was right. He made his choice. He moved with a speed that shocked Frank, closing the distance between them and planting himself directly in the man's path. He was taller than Frank, and for the first time he let his full height and presence be felt. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried the cold, deadly weight of forged steel. "She is not filth," Nathaniel said, his eyes locked on Frank's. "She and her brother are my guests. They were caught in the storm, and I gave them shelter, as any decent man would." Frank scoffed. "Decent? There's not that decent about mixing with their kind. They're savages, Nate. You've gone soft in the head. They are under my protection," Nathaniel continued, his voice dropping even lower. "On my land, which means you will show them respect, or you will get off my property. Now." The challenge hung in the frozen air, absolute and non-negotiable. Frank stared at him, his mouth agape. He was looking at a different man. The quiet, grieving farmer was gone, replaced by someone with a spine of iron and a fire in his eyes. Frank searched Nathaniel's face for any sign of weakness, any hint of bluff, and found none. He saw only an unyielding wall of resolve. With a final, disgusted sneer, Frank took a step back. "You've made your bed, farmer," he snarled. "Don't come crying to me when they slit your throat in your sleep and take everything you own." He turned and began to trudge away, his snowshoes crunching angrily in the snow. "You'll regret this," he shouted over his shoulder. Nathaniel didn't watch him go. He held his ground until Frank was a distant speck. Then he slowly turned back to the cabin. His heart was pounding, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Desert Lily was still standing in the doorway. The fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by an expression he couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of shock, gratitude, and something else, something deep and profound. In her world, a white man had never stood up for her. They were a source of danger, of loss, of broken promises. But this man, this quiet farmer with the sad eyes, had just faced down one of his own kind to defend her honor and her safety. He had built walls of ice around his heart to keep the world out. She had done the same. But in that moment, as their eyes met across the snow-dusted threshold, they both felt the unmistakable sensation of those walls beginning to crack, to shift, to melt away under the heat of a courageous and unexpected act of grace. In the week following Frank's hostile visit, the world outside began to thaw. The oppressive weight of the snow lessened day by day, revealing the brown, sleeping earth beneath. Inside the cabin, a different kind of thawing had occurred. The final vestiges of mistrust between Nathaniel and Desert Lily had melted away, leaving behind a warm and quiet intimacy that settled into the spaces between their words. They moved around each other with an easy grace, a silent understanding that needed no explanation. The small cabin no longer felt like a prison, but a haven. Keel was now almost fully healed. The color had returned to his face, his strength had come back, and the shy smile Nathaniel had coaxed from him with the carved sparrow now appeared more frequently. He would follow Nathaniel around the cabin, watching with wide, curious eyes as he mended a strap of leather or sharpened his axe, a small, silent shadow. Nathaniel found himself dreading the inevitable moment of their departure. The silence he had once craved now seemed like a threat, a promise of the crushing loneliness he knew would return with a vengeance. The cabin, once filled only with ghosts of his past, had been alive with the quiet murmur of Desert Lily's voice and the soft footfalls of her brother. The thought of it becoming empty again was a pain he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Oh, the day came on a crisp, clear morning when the air was so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. Nathaniel was outside, splitting the last of the dry logs from his porch, when he heard a sound that did not belong. It was the soft, rhythmic thud of horses' hooves on the damp earth. He looked up, his hand tightening on the axe handle, and saw them cresting the low ridge to the west. There were 5 riders, all native, moving with a disciplined, silent purpose. They were not a hunting party. They were warriors. Their faces were grim, their eyes scanning the landscape, and they carried rifles across their laps. Nathaniel's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they were looking for Desert Lily and Keel. He stood his ground as they approached, the axe held loosely at his side. He was 1 man and they were 5, but this was his land, and the people in his cabin were under his protection. The riders fanned out as they neared, forming a silent, intimidating semicircle around him. The man at their center, clearly the leader, was older than the others. His face was a testament to a long and difficult life, lined with the wisdom of winters and the sorrow of battles. His long, graying hair was braided with eagle feathers, and his eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to look straight through Nathaniel, weighing his very soul. This was Vikasa. "You are the man who lives on this land," Vikasa said. His English was slow, deliberate, each word carrying immense weight. It was not a question. "I am," Nathaniel replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "2 of our people are missing. A woman and a boy. Their tracks led them here, to your door." Vikasa's gaze was hard as flint. "Where are they?" The cabin door opened before Nathaniel could answer. Desert Lily emerged, stepping out into the sunlight. She saw the riders, saw Vikasa, and her face showed not fear but a calm resolve. Keel appeared behind her, peeking around her legs, his eyes wide. The warriors tensed. Their hands tightened on their rifles. They saw what their minds had been conditioned to expect. A white man, armed, with a captive woman and child. To them, this was a scene of abduction, not rescue. Vikasa's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting from Nathaniel to Desert Lily. "Are you harmed, daughter?" he asked in their native tongue. It was then that Desert Lily did something that stunned them all. She walked forward and stood beside Nathaniel, placing herself between him and her own people. She faced the elder, her back straight, her chin held high. "He saved us, wise one," she declared, her voice ringing with a strength and clarity that commanded their attention. A murmur of disbelief went through the warriors. Vikasa's stern expression did not change. "He is a white man. They are not known for their kindness. This one is," she insisted, turning her head slightly to look at Nathaniel. Her eyes filled with a fierce loyalty. "The great storm came, and my brother was near death. This man, Nathaniel, took us in. He shared his fire, his food, his medicine. He sat vigil with me through the night when the fever was high. He kept us safe." She then told them of Frank, of the angry neighbor who had come filled with hate and threats. The warriors listened, their expressions shifting from suspicion to grudging attention. "The other man called us filth," Desert Lily continued, her voice trembling with the memory of the insult. "He wanted to drive us out into the snow to die. And Nathaniel, he stood against his own kind. He told this man that we were under his protection. He offered his life to protect our honor." She looked back at Vikasa, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I have known the cruelty of his people, but I have also known the honor of this one man. He is not our enemy." As if on cue, Keel stepped forward from behind her. He held out his small hand, and in his palm lay the roughly carved sparrow. He offered it to Vikasa. The elder took the small wooden bird, his gaze softening as he turned it over in his weathered hands. It was a simple object, but it told a story more powerful than any words. A story of kindness offered to a child, a bridge built between 2 worlds. Vikasa looked from the carving to Nathaniel. He looked for a long, silent moment, his ancient eyes searching for any hint of deception, any trace of the evil he had come to expect from the white man. He found none. He saw only a quiet, solitary man whose eyes held a deep sadness, but also an undeniable integrity. Slowly, deliberately, Vikasa raised his right hand, palm open, in the universal sign of peace. "The spirit of a man is not known by the color of his skin," the elder said, his voice now gentle, "but by the tracks he leaves on the hearts of others. You have left good tracks here, Nathaniel." He gave a solemn nod. "We are in your debt." The tension broke like a fever. The warriors relaxed their grips on their rifles, their faces mirroring the understanding of their leader. The time for departure had come. It was swift and final. Desert Lily gathered their few things while Nathaniel saddled one of his horses for her and Keel to ride. The farewell was a quiet, awkward affair, freighted with all the things they could not say. She stood before him, the reins of the horse in her hand. Keel was already mounted, looking down at Nathaniel with a shy wave. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate for all that had passed between them. "Be safe," he replied, his own voice thick with emotion. He wanted to say more. He wanted to ask her to stay. He wanted to tell her that the thought of this cabin without her was a return to a gray, lifeless world. But the words were trapped behind the wall of his grief, the habit of solitude too strong to break. He watched her mount the horse with a fluid grace. She gathered the reins, ready to join her people. He felt a profound sense of loss wash over him, as if the sun were being extinguished from his world. He had just found a reason to feel again, and now it was riding away. She must have felt his despair. Just as she was about to turn the horse, she paused and looked back at him. Her dark eyes locked with his, and in their depths, he saw not a goodbye, but a promise. A future. "The soil on this land is good," she said, her voice soft but clear enough to carry across the space between them. "And the desert lily," she added, a small knowing smile touching her lips, "always finds its way back to good soil." And then she was gone, riding with her people toward the ridge, becoming a smaller and smaller figure against the vast western sky until she disappeared from view. Nathaniel stood there for a long time, the imprint of her final words etched onto his heart. He looked at his small cabin, at the land around him. It was no longer a place of exile, it was home, a place of healing, a place worth tending. He was still alone, but he was no longer lonely. For the first time in 2 years, he was not a man defined by what he had lost, but a man sustained by the hope of what might one day return. A promise, like a stubborn seed, had been planted in the barren ground of his heart, and he would wait for it to bloom. True honor is not measured by the barriers we build to protect ourselves, but by the bridges of empathy we dare to cross. In a world divided by prejudice, a single act of courage and compassion can reveal a shared humanity, planting a seed of hope in the most desolate of hearts. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.